said, I'm Aaron.
Aaron.
Hi, Aaron.
Hey, Aaron.
Hi, Aaron.
Cool,
That's my
thank
friend.
you. So I really have done everything I can since Desiree asked me to do this to not think about what it was going to look like. Because if I do, I will obsess about it, and I will get in my head about it, and I will easily make it about me and less about him. I'm very uncomfortable talking about myself. I'm very uncomfortable doing anything about myself. But as Desiree was gracious enough to remind me when she asked me to do this, this isn't about me. This isn't talking about me. It's about glorifying God. And that is something that I really love doing. Rita started this by saying that I'm somebody who does not get rattled. I can assure you I'm as rattled now as I've ever been in my life. So,
We love you, brother.
without really knowing, well, after what happened in the secret place, how could I not be? So without really knowing what this is supposed to look like, I'm just going to start off on some key things that happened in my life that I believe sort of transformed me into thinking the way I used to think. I'll talk about what happened that brought me to understand that the way I was thinking was not correct, and I'll sort of talk about what my life is like today. I don't know how long I'm supposed to talk, but I'm probably not going to make it.
8 o'clock at night now.
Yeah, how about 7:45? So I grew up relatively in a state of poverty, but I really didn't know it. My mother did a very good job of making me and my brother feel like we were in a normal, happy household. Looking back, I can kind of see how dysfunctional things were, and a lot of the things that I was exposed to and experienced, a lot of my schoolmates probably didn't experience. My brother's 4 years older than me. My mother was a bit older than me. She was 30 when she had me, she was the oldest mom out of my group of friends. She was also the least healthy mom out of my group of friends. She had diabetes. She had kidney failure. She was on dialysis. And that sort of comes into play later. The first time that I was ever exposed to substances, I am a recovering addict. I've been in recovery since December 21st, 2021. So a lot of the story is going to involve substance use, or it's going to talk about it anyway. My first exposure to substances was December 31st, 1999. It was the New Year's Eve going into the Y2K scare. My mother let me have a quarter of a bottle of, look at how much I'm shaking, a quarter of a bottle of her Zima or Smirnoff or whatever it was. And I didn't really enjoy the way it tasted, and I didn't get drunk off it, but I did really like the fact that I was doing something I knew I wasn't supposed to be doing. That thrilled me in a way that I was not able to really recognize at the time, and it's only now looking back I can understand what the appeal was. My next serious exposure to alcohol was so severe that I actually, I messed myself. I soiled myself. And I was 14. It was also New Year's, and I drank a bottle of 151 because I didn't know what 151 was. I didn't know that those numbers denote the quantity of alcohol in it. And I just thought it was something fun to do. So, my mother's health problems came to a head when I was 14, about to turn 15. She had a operation in her arm where she received the dialysis, and she got a metal rod implanted, is how I remember it. And the metal rod implant got infected. The surgery didn't go perfectly, and we got a call on like a Friday to, she got admitted to the hospital on a Friday, and then Sunday she was dead. And we kind of thought that everything was going to be okay until it just suddenly wasn't. I remember getting the call on Sunday that we all needed to come to the doctor's office, or to the hospital, sorry. And she was still alive, but it was looking pretty critical. And I just remember this alarm going off in the ICU, and just doctors running. And then about a minute later, we got called back to her room, my brother and I realized that that noise was the alert that my mom died, and that doctors were running to bring her back. I was 14. I really didn't know how to process that. We were back in the room, and she died again, and they brought her back again, and she died again, and they brought her back again. And 2 of those times were in front of me and my brother. And then my grandmother decided that we probably don't need to keep doing this to her. My mother and my grandmother both believed in God. So in my grandma's eyes, she was giving her to him when she decided not to continue to try to resuscitate her. I did get to hold my mom's hand as she departed this world. I got to tell her I love her before she departed this world. And I kind of had an understanding of God up to that point, but it was based more on fear than it was on knowing his love. My mother was a devout Christian, and she absolutely loved God. But because she was so infirm, because she was in such poor health, she wasn't really able to discipline my brother and I, and we took absolute advantage of that. We were bad children. We didn't do anything she told us we had to do. Any threat that came from her was facilitated by another member of the family. She would tell one of our cousins, she would tell my father, she would tell a friend's dad. She could never really carry out the punishment. So when we were younger, the fear of going to hell was always used as a way to sort of get me in line. So most of my exposure and understanding of God came from being afraid of what he would do to me if I didn't listen. Obviously, that's a warped and very inaccurate depiction of what it is to know Jesus. But because that's what I knew, and because what I experienced when I was 14 and unable to process the fact that my mother was going home to be with her Creator, I felt like God took my mom. I felt like I'm 14. All I can think about is the pain I'm experiencing and the loss that I'm experiencing. All I know is that I had a mom. She was in relatively good health as far as I knew, and then she was dead. And I didn't have anything to blame. I didn't understand that people just get sick. So God took my mom. That caused me to believe some really untrue things about God. And rather than just admit that I was angry at him, just admit that I couldn't come to terms with what he had done, I decided I wasn't going to believe in a God who would take my mother away. That sort of became the basis of my personality going forward. It started off small. I would just hang out with the kids in high school that wore all black, which is something that's carried on, as you can see. I would, as a teenager, the family that I went to live with after she passed away was not my blood family. It was friends, but they were also Christian as best as they knew how to be. And I would say things that were blasphemous or sacrilegious just kind of to shock people. That was my way of expressing myself, was denouncing Christ, saying terrible things about him, saying terrible things about people that believed in him. As that went on, as I got older, my rebellion against God got a little more polished. It became less about just making people upset and more about trying to present myself as being too intelligent. When people would ask me, I wouldn't say that I didn't believe in God because I was hurt about my mom. In fact, I denied that it happened because my mom died. I would tell people that I remembered a couple years before my mom died, stopping believing in God. Looking back, I know that that's not true. My life sort of went the way you would expect somebody who completely tears themselves away from knowing God went, or would go, rather. I started experimenting with drugs, more intense than just occasionally drinking alcohol on weekends. But I did that every weekend. My brother, when my mom died, had to move out. He was 4 years older than me, so he was 18 when she died. He got his own place, and he would have a party every weekend. I would smoke different drugs. I would take different pills. I would drink different things. I found that the more things that I would put in my body, essentially the more things I would do to my body, the more I would subject myself to, the more approval and the more acceptance I felt from the people around me. I really liked this image of myself that I was creating in people's minds of being willing to go one step further than anybody else. If somebody was willing to drink, I was willing to drink more. If somebody was willing to put something in them, I was willing to put more in me. If somebody was willing to fight somebody, I was willing to fight 5 people. So, yeah, I kind of moved away from that as I got older, just because I didn't have access to that sort of stuff. I didn't drive. I wasn't able to continue to make it to my brother's house all the time. I started following authors like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who are prominent atheists and philosophers, if you will. Richard Dawkins is a biologist, but the crux of their work is less about science as it pertains to the natural world and more about science as it pertains to disproving God or being the antithesis of the religious question. And anybody that believed in God, I would consider myself better than. I even told somebody, wow, you're really smart for somebody that believes in God. Because I associate religious faith with lack of intellectual power. If you need to believe in something like that, you don't have the capacity to accept the world as it really is, or so I thought. Because of the way that I was and the way that I expressed myself and the way that I sort of railed against people, the couple that let me live with them after my mom died eventually kind of put me out. And when I was 19, my grandmother got into too severe a condition to be able to live by herself. So in what seemed like an act of kindness and willingness on my part to take care of her, but what was really me needing to go somewhere, I moved in with her to take care of her. And I probably got kind of high on the way everybody received that. My family absolutely loved me. They thought so highly of me because I was willing to give up my own time in my own life, put my own stuff on hold to take care of my grandmother. If they only knew the way that I would go on to treat her. She had dementia, and the first year or so wasn't really that bad. I took relatively good care of her. She had home health aides that would come, but they would only come for an hour 3 times a day. And the rest of the time I pretty much had to be there, because if she were left on her own, she could fall, she would get confused, she could seriously hurt herself if she were left alone for any amount of time. She stopped realizing that I was her grandson about a year into it and started thinking that I was her dead husband. And she started talking to me like I was her husband. And she would talk to me in a very loving way, but she would also talk to me in a way that was very hard for my 19-year-old brain to sort of comprehend, because she thought I was her husband. So she came on to me pretty aggressively. And that sort of changed the way that I looked at her. I no longer saw her as my grandma. I no longer had her in that position of being revered and respected. Now she was more like a little kid or a burden in my mind. And continually feeling that way about her, she frustrated me one day, and I had kind of spoken roughly to her up to that point, but she frustrated me real bad one day when I was trying to pick her up and put her on her little toilet. And she started like jerking around, and I sat her down on it and I hit her. And I didn't even realize I had done something wrong to myself. I knew that I had done something wrong because I didn't tell anybody about it. But I also knew that she couldn't tell anybody about it. And if she did, no one would believe her. She has dementia. So I only say that to say the degree to which I had removed myself from knowing God was the degree to which I was willing to stoop down low and surrender the things that I never would have surrendered in the past. So for the next 7 or 8, 9, 10 years, I was going from one girlfriend to the next. My grandmother eventually passed away. She went to a nursing home. I would get a girlfriend. She would move in with me. I would cheat on her. She would move out. I would get another girlfriend, act inappropriately towards her. The whole time I'm kind of using alcohol, but not really doing anything else. And then when I turned 28, I met a cousin of mine who had been in prison for like 30 years. At this time, I was 3 years into a relationship with a woman who allowed me to step in and be a father to her son. I still consider him my son to this day. I subjected that boy to some really terrible things, though. When I met my cousin, when I was 28, he had been in prison for like 30 years of his life. He'd killed people. He'd done really, really high-profile crimes. He was on the front page of the Beacon Journal more than once. And I just ran into him in a bar and introduced myself to him. And after that, I started getting drugs from him. And he would let me, because we were family, just get a tab of a few $100s at a time, and then I'd pay him back $50, and then I'd be allowed to just keep getting more from him. Because of this, my dependency on amphetamines became so severe that there was nothing I wouldn't do. I took my son with me. He was like 5. I went from Wadsworth to Dave's supermarket parking lot to pick up an 8-ball from somebody at like 3 in the morning with a 5-year-old sleeping in the back seat. I had people over at the house. I was putting drugs out on the table when my girlfriend or my son could have walked out at any time. I was staying away for 3 or 4 or 5 days at a time without telling anybody where I was. I would turn my phone off. I was usually with another woman because the woman had drugs, and I was willing to compromise anything to get more drugs. This whole time I had absolutely no concept of God. I've removed myself so far from it that I'm actually posting things on Facebook just to get a rise out of people like hail Satan. I'm saying ads like just to get a rise out of people, just to upset people. I remember that being the motivation was, if I could get a shock reaction, that's still something that can get me somewhere. Completely dependent on amphetamines. In 2019, I was carrying some on me, and I got pulled over, and this is probably one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me. They found some in the car when they searched it, because I looked like a meth head. The truck looked like a meth head's truck. They searched me every time I got pulled over. The officer, I had a lot in the truck, but they only found a little residue on a dollar bill, and it was such a small amount that they actually just gave me a summons and let me walk away. Interestingly, they let me get some tools and stuff out of the truck and walk away. They impounded the truck, but they let me take my tools. And among the things that I put in the bucket that I carried away from the truck was the larger quantity of drugs that they didn't find. So as I'm sort of going back and forth in court fighting that, I am still making terrible choices. I'm still using. It didn't do anything to slow down my using. In fact, I think I got away. I got away with a ½ an ounce of meth and got to walk away from the cop car with it. I kind of feel invincible at this point. So I buy a gun, which my goodness, could you imagine if I had to use a gun? I can't get up here and talk in front of you guys, and I like all of you, without sweating and sputtering and saying, Could you imagine if I was in a situation and actually had to use a gun? What are you doing, bro? But anyway, thank God one day I got pulled over, and I had the gun in the car, and because I got it from the cousin with 30 years in prison and with multiple bodies and what have you, I assumed that the gun was stolen and had been used in crimes, but it turned out it wasn't. It was a clean gun, and the only charge I got from that was felony for carrying a concealed weapon. So they take me to jail that night, and they add that to the charge that I'm facing for the little bit of meth that they found in my truck. And I go to jail, I plead guilty, I go to RIP for a little while, 60 days, I do absolutely wonderfully. I'm like a model client. Derek, my caseworker there, said that he would be honored to recommend me to come back and work there. And I was like, brother, I'm just doing this to get out of here. Like, there's no chill. One thing I noticed about that time, 3 times a week they would have Bible studies come in from pastors from outside, and they would host a Bible study, and they would give you candy bars. And I like candy bars. Like, if you want to get me to go do something, and you got a Twix, you got a shot at getting me there. So I found myself going for the chocolate bars at first, and because Rick sucks, and anything other than just laying on the cot and reading is worthy endeavor, I found myself really, really, really liking when they would sing, and singing along with them. And even though these songs were about God, who I didn't believe in, I found they were my favorite thing about being in RIP, which I know isn't a very high bar, but best thing there. And I stopped going just for the Hershey's and for the Twix, and I went for singing the songs, which is interesting, as I'll get to in a second. But I got out of RIP, got connected back up with my cousin, and immediately started using again. I think the longest amount of time I've ever had clean was those 2 months that I was in RIP. Until now, obviously. So I got out, started using again, managed to get clean for a couple days, and then I would go drop for my probation officer, and then I'd start using again. And I timed that pretty well. I was able to manage that for about 2 months, and then on the 3rd month, I was under the influence of methamphetamines, and I just decided not to go drop. And I lied to my PO, and I had a pretty good rapport with her at that time, so she believed me for the first month. And then 2 months later, she's like, Aaron, I really should have gotten these lab results back from CHC. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I can call them. And she was like, no, I'll call them. And I was like, okay. So I knew my time was about up, but I'm still riding it like crazy. She called me back a couple days later and said that she spoke with CHC, and they had not seen me at like 5 months up to that point. And I knew that. That wasn't a surprise to me, but it sure was surprising to her. So I just told her, I'm sorry. I was terrified. I was high, and I decided not to go. And then I lied already, so I kind of just kept building more lies on top of it, because that's the only thing I really know how to do. So she violated me, and she sent me back to my judge, who had sentenced me for the previous 2 cases, the meth and the gun. And that was Judge Allison Bro, who some of you know, and I absolutely love her, and she saved my life when she, because of that probation violation, sentenced me to IBH. She gave me the life penalty, essentially, because I was dead. I did not know God, and the little bit I knew about Him was so completely, unbelievably wrong. From what little exposure I had as a child. I remember watching Snow White, and that scared me, because I thought that, because my mom told me the witch was the devil, and so I would watch Snow White as a kid, and then I would want to go to church the next. It was always a response to fear. It was never out of a genuine desire to go and know who He was. So I went to IBH. I had nothing at that point. My relationship with the girlfriend who had allowed me to be a father to her son was dead. I was no father. I had sort of bled everybody dry that I could. I had manipulated everybody to the extent that I could. So about a week or 2 into my time at IBH, I did that thing that is like in the movies, and I think that a lot of us do. And I got down and I said, I really don't believe in you. I just want you to know that. But if you are real, show me. And he did. He responded in a way that I would explain it to somebody who was a believer, and they wouldn't be surprised. And that surprised me even more. I was like, don't you get it? All this stuff, it's like there's somebody paying personal attention to me, conspiring almost to make sure that I'm aware that they love me. And they're like, yeah, that's kind of what we've been telling you. So he did that. And one of the primary ways that he showed himself to me was by coincidences that would occur. I referenced with a friend of mine at IBH while I was still there that I talked about that scripture where Jesus is led out into the he goes out into the wilderness. He's been fasting for 40 days and he's tempted by the devil. And I think what it was, I was having a hard time, and I was relating to my friend who was a Christian, who was at IBH with me. Who am I to think that I won't have a hard time? Even Jesus was tempted by Satan. And then the next day, my cousin, a different cousin than the one, obviously, my cousin, who was a constant source of support, really my only source of support at the time, mailed me a little pamphlet from her church, and it was that scripture about Jesus being tempted by Satan. I can't really remember a lot of the ways that happened, but I remember that being an almost everyday occurrence where something I would think of, something I would say, something I would hear, and then it would happen the next day. And on January 25th of 2022, I was in the chapel at IBH, and I knew I had this weird, vague concept of God, but I wouldn't call it Jesus. I refused to call it Jesus. I actually refused to let anybody hear me call it God, because that was too much like buying into the whole Christian thing, in my opinion. So I'm in the chapel, and Sister T starts praying, and I close my eyes for the first time during a prayer. Anytime anybody had prayed before that at family gatherings, I would always stand there with my eyes open, be quiet, respectfully, but I closed my eyes, and I felt this overwhelming outpouring of love. This thing came over me. My eyes were closed, and it was like if we opened all the blinds in here right now, and you would be able to see that there was light in the room, all of a sudden, that's what I felt. I just felt light and love, and I started crying and smiling, and I probably looked like a madman. And I didn't know it at the time, but my heart, I had a heart of stone, and I was being given a heart of flesh.
Yes, hallelujah.
So like I said a minute ago, I wasn't really into the whole Bible thing at RIP initially, but the songs really got me. At IBH, they let you go out for meetings, and some of the meetings can be church service, so I started coming here with some friends. And the way that the worship team sang was the thing that finally sort of broke through that callous membrane in my heart of denying Jesus. I knew that the way these songs made me feel, this weird imaginary concept of a higher power that I had adopted, was not worthy of the uplifting, absolute abandon that I felt when I heard them sing. The only thing that was worthy of that feeling was the person that those songs are about. That's why it was able to cut through all of the bitterness and hard-heartedness that I had and talk directly to my soul.
Yeah.
So, yeah. It's 8 o'clock.
Does it really keep going? Clock's getting warmed up. Think you was gonna make it?
It's 8 o'clock, brother.
I'm here till 9, brother.
It's 8:01. We were supposed to come here. Anyway, so
Finish up.
I came here. We had a prophetic conference a couple weeks after I came here as a client. And that's when I knew that there was some doubt before then, but I knew that Jesus was it, because there was a breakout session, a prayer breakout session, and I went over there where Tim was sitting, and I kneeled down facing the wall, and I prayed, and Angel walked up to me and said, everybody I assume knows Angel, because you were faithful in this, because you were obedient, because you knelt down and turned from your wicked ways, she had a word from God. And that word was 2 Chronicles 7, verse 14. And if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will restore their land. And that has been my story since then. So, yeah, I love you all. There's so much more, but there will be a part 2 sometime in the future. And, yeah, I don't know. I love you. Thank you.
Yeah.